All right, good morning. As soon as we can get Dr. Long to settle, I'm sorry, Josh. It was just too good to pass up. Dr. Long needs more coffee. Someone please get Dr. Long more coffee. All right, so good morning, and I'll have more to say in a minute, but I want to begin by introducing two of our fellow Brown chairs who will be in charge of the co-organizers of the next Brown Symposium, Laura Hobgood and Fumiko Futamura.
Thank you. This has been an amazing Brown Symposium, and so thank you to all of you all for being here and to the organizers and all the speakers. This has been really awesome. I'm Dr. Futamura and joined the faculty of Southwestern in 2007. My areas of research are in matrix theory and math and art, so namely connections between perspective drawing and projective geometry. I have the pleasure of teaching a wide variety of courses here at Southwestern: Explorations in Math, which is a lower level class, Modern Calculus 1, Linear Algebra, Geometry, Algebraic Structures. This will be my first time planning a Brown Symposium, and I'm grateful and so excited to be working with Dr. Hobgood, who has many years of experience.
Thank you, Fumiko. I'm Dr. Hobgood. I joined the faculty of Southwestern in 1998. My areas of teaching and research cover animals and religion, the history of the Christian and Jewish traditions, apocalypse and dystopia, and religion and environmental justice. This will be the 5th Brown Symposium I've had the honor to plan since 2003, and it's so exciting to be co-coordinating for the first time. I mean, as you all can see, when you have two wonderful folks working together, they can come up with some brilliant ideas. So I'm looking very forward to having this experience co-coordinating with Fumiko.
So our research areas obviously extend beyond math and religion into art, animals, and environmental studies. After brainstorming the possibilities, we are excited to announce that we are developing a fascinating Brown Symposium that delves into the intersections of mathematics, nature, sustainability, and environmental justice.
So we're thrilled to be working together on the 42nd Brown Symposium for spring 2025 and hope to see all of you all there. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm not sure how to even begin after about 40 hours or so, but thank you all so much, especially those of you who've been here through all of it. We hope you are feeling full of possibilities, maybe even impossibilities, and full of hope and full of a sense of your own abilities to change the world. So, along with one of the Texas's great gifts to the world, breakfast tacos, I'll turn things over to my colleague Kim Smith.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Hope you're enjoying your tacos. I am very happy to introduce our final speaker in this 41st Brown Symposium, Dr. Mika Tosca. Yeah. Mika is a climate scientist with a PhD in Earth System Science from the University of California, Irvine. She conducted her postdoctoral work and continued to work at the world-renowned NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, the leading center for exploring the solar system and more distant expanses that humans cannot yet reach. In an inspirational and radically interdisciplinary move, in 2017, she took a position at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she is currently an associate professor and works with young artists to push the boundaries of collaboration. She continues her ongoing work, investigating the link between climate and wildfire, and also imagines ways that artists and designers can collaborate with climate scientists in an effort to better communicate and conduct climate science research. Mika has written about the emerging synthesis of art and science and has been invited to speak on the intersection of science and art as we look to build post-climate change worlds, including a role as plenary speaker at the 2022 American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting. She also spoke about the importance of combining art and science to non-scientists at the 2022 Honcho Campout Queer Electronic Music Festival. And she is an active participant in the Eco Voice Project, a collective that uses music and interdisciplinary collaboration to inform, connect, and inspire people to act for environmentally just causes. She is a vocal and innovative activist for urgently addressing the climate crisis. Please welcome Dr. Mika Tosca.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for waking up. I heard from some students last night that 9:30 is early, so thank you all for being here. I'll try not to talk too much into the microphone. Okay, so I guess I get to take us home. Let me just figure out how I'm going to hold all this. So my talk today is titled Solarpunk Futures, Post-nihilist Solutions to the Climate Crisis Emerging from the Synthesis of Art and Environmental Science. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is brand new. You're the first people to hear it. So don't judge me too hard if it's not good. So I am a climate scientist. You're probably like, what is this person, a climate scientist at an art school? So I'm a climate scientist who teaches at an art school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, SAIC. And I, as Kim said in my introduction, I moved there in 2017. I took a position teaching science to art students, and this initiated not only a big shift in where I was living and the fact that I had to endure winter, but also the fact that it changed sort of the direction and the trajectory of my professional research and my entire approach to the climate crisis. So before coming to SAIC, I studied wildfire. I studied the interaction between smoke that comes off of the top of fires, right, and the climate system. And now I look mainly at ways that art can inform, communicate, and even help us like sort of do better science. And the picture here is a still from a little movie that I filmed last fall with a student that I've been working with, Javi Miller. I'm going to show a lot of his work in this presentation. He's great, super talented, all of that. So let's start. Oops. So climate change is bad and getting worse. I think we all know this. Storms are getting stronger, polar ice caps are melting, wildfires are becoming more numerous and lasting longer, floods are inundating both coastal areas and also other regions prone to heavy rainfall. Summers are getting hotter, which is causing a shift in where we can grow crops, which include, you know, the grape harvest, for example, in Europe last year was significantly impacted by a heat wave. Sea level is rising, yada, 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 right? And this is all our fault, humans' fault, right? If you look at the temperature record for the last however long, 2,000 years or even the last 150 years, it's unmistakable that the temperature, the globally average temperature of the Earth is rising. And it's rising very significantly. If you compare it in this first graph to the temperature for the last 2,000 years, the reconstructed temperature of the planet for the last 2,000 years, you can see it was relatively steady / maybe even heading into the next ice age, which would take thousands of years, of course. And then you can see at the very end, this abrupt rise, this warming, which is unprecedented, actually, in this record. And it's actually unprecedented going back, you know, almost 3 million years. And when you compare computer simulations of this temperature, of the global temperature, and you look at computer simulations that consider only natural influences, and you look at simulations that include human activity, the only lines that match are the observations and the simulated human and natural global temperature. And so this is sort of the evidence that, all the evidence that I needed in 2006 when I decided to be a climate scientist, to study climate change in grad school and all of that. So I hope it's convincing to you. It was definitely convincing to me. And sorry, I have this really bad habit. I've never had a clicker, so I have this bad habit of constantly walking back to my computer to hit the next thing. But this is so much freedom. So unfortunately, projections into the future are also not great, right? So before I get into this, I like to start my talks with doom and gloom and end them with a lot of optimism. So I want you all to be really sad, and then I want you to leave here really happy. And I'm going to check in with you, because I think you're going to be really happy. So unfortunately, the projections going into the future range anywhere from an additional maybe degree Celsius of global warming to potentially 4 or 5 degrees of global warming. You can see that in the first figure here. The various scenarios suggest a range of global temperatures by the year 2100. This would correlate with a very stark decrease in the ocean surface pH. Basically, the oceans will become more acidic. It will also correspond to a rise in sea level, which will continue long after 2100, long after we stop emitting carbon dioxide. The oceans are very slow to respond to this type of forcing, and so we could be looking at not just 1 meter of sea level rise, but 2, 3, or more in the next 400 years or so. And also a rapid decline in Arctic sea ice coverage, which many projections now suggest that the Arctic will be ice-free by the middle of this century, which is a problem for many reasons. Obviously, it's a problem for animals and people who consider the Arctic home. It's also a problem for the globe because the removal of all of that ice will expose a dark ocean surface, which will actually cause more warming. So the Arctic is really concerning. This, of course, has led to a great deal of climate anxiety. I'm sure I just gave you all anxiety right now. And I'm sure many of you in here who consider yourselves part of Generation Z, which is most of my students, are really carrying this burden of climate anxiety and climate pain very, very heavily, right? You've got your whole life in front of you, and I'm telling you that it's going to be marred by all of these horrible changes to the Earth system, right? So this has led to a ton of climate anxiety, and I asked my students to elucidate some of their anxieties to me, and I'm not showing them all here. I have like hundreds of them. I ask them every time I teach, but I just wanted to show this one because this one, every time I read it, it really just hits me really hard. So one of my climate concerns is that as each coming generation is born and acclimates, they won't have known a climate that was once more stable, and they won't know a normal, right? So depending on how rapid climate change is happening around us at the time, some folks may have a hard time caring to reverse climate change or even grasping what's actually so wrong, right? As subsequent generations are born, we lose the institutional knowledge of what the world was like, and this becomes the new normal, right? So how do we address this anxiety? Before I flip to the next slide, I'd like to do a little activity with you all. I know, I'm sorry. I'm a teacher at an art school, so it's activity, activity, activity. So I was wondering if I could get a show of hands. If you consider yourself to be a part of nature, raise your hand. Do you consider yourselves to be a part of nature? Okay, does anybody not consider themselves to be a part of nature? Raise your hand. Not a single person. Okay. Now this is even more participation, I'm sorry. Hope you've had your coffee. I'm wondering if folks could maybe raise their hand or shout out very politely a word or a phrase that comes to mind when I say the word natural. What comes to mind? Trees. Anyone else? What else? Soil. Green. Ecosystem. Organic. That kind of stuff, right? Okay. Now, same thing. What comes to mind when I say the word unnatural? Process. Plastic. Concrete. Synthetic. Capitalism. Someone always says capitalism. Okay, so what happened here? There's a huge cognitive dissonance. I don't know if you noticed it. You all raised your hands. I'm a part of nature. But when I asked you to list things that are unnatural, you listed things that are created by humans for humans, right? Our world is unnatural. We have, for all intents and purposes, separated ourselves from nature. And yet, we very sort of deep within us want to be a part of nature. We really do. We consider ourselves to be natural beings. We're made of carbon and water and all these different elements, right? We are part of the natural world. And yet, rhetorically, we've separated ourselves from nature, right? We think of unnatural things as being all the things that we use every day: plastic, concrete, capitalism, right? So there is a cognitive dissonance here. And so we need to reimagine our future as one where humanity and nature actually truly do coexist, where we are actually a part of nature, right? Not just, in our minds, or not just flowery words. We actually have to be a part of nature, right? And so we need to redefine the boundaries between what's natural and unnatural. And this is where the idea of solarpunk comes in, and I'll get to that a little bit later on, right? But we are our human bodies, right? We need to reintegrate ourselves with nature. I think part of the reason why it's so difficult for us to accept that we have rhetorically separated ourselves from nature is because people are really terrified of loss. People are terrified of the loss of nature, right? How many of you have been to a national park before? Exactly. We love national parks. National parks are untouched nature, right? Kinda. I mean, they're untouched because we said we can't touch them. So everything has been influenced by us, right? The whole natural world is different because of us, because we exist on this planet. And so we have to reimagine our place on this planet, okay? We have to rethink how we interact with the natural world around us. And specifically, we need to get rid of this idea of loss. We need to move on from that. We need to move on from this fear of losing everything, the loss of nature, the loss of normality, all of these things, and reimagine a better world. And so, as you might expect, I'm going to argue that there's a role for art in helping us do that, right? So I'm a climate scientist. I'm not an artist. Every time someone writes like an article about me or introduces me, except for this time, they call me an artist and a scientist. I don't actually identify as an artist. Part of that is because at this art school where I work, they told me, when you go up for tenure, you're not an artist, you're a scientist. Because if you're an artist, then they're not gonna, trust you. Because they're all artists, right? So I'm a scientist. I do work with artists. And the reason I work with artists, the reason I'm so committed to incorporating art in the solutions is because, partly because of this slide, right? So when we look at this poll of Americans that was conducted by the AP NORC, when asked, is climate change happening? 75% of Americans say yes. That's actually pretty high, right? I actually didn't even think it was that high. I thought it was much lower. But when asked who is causing it, only, somehow this circle got off orientation here, but only about 54% of Americans agreed that it's because of what we're doing, because of human activity, right? So there is a bit of a disconnect here. There's a bit of a disconnect. We have a bit of work to do. People are convinced that something is happening, which, I mean, good, because it is. But they're not exactly convinced yet that that everyone is not convinced that it's our fault. Additionally, this one's more funny. It's usually funnier when I deliver it to scientists. When asked how Americans see scientists, 90% say that we're intelligent, so that's amazing. Go us. But only about 50% of Americans consider scientists to be good communicators, and almost as many consider us to be socially awkward, which I do think checks out. Also, climate change is, as philosopher Timothy Morton calls it, a hyperobject. This is an abstracted object. It's too big, both temporally, right, in time, and spatially in space for us to really define it, right? If I asked you, what is climate change? If you think about that for a second, it is actually kind of hard to define. It's all of these things. It's temperatures rising, it's ecosystems changing, it's viruses and bacteria spreading to parts of the world that they weren't in before. There's all these facets of climate change. So Timothy Morton calls climate change a hyperobject in their book Hyperobjects, which I highly recommend if folks are interested in it. And so it's essentially this big abstracted object. And while we all consider abstractions, right, in our work, artists and designers in particular, right, intelligently address abstraction, create objects every day. Also, we struggle to care about numbers, right? The average person, even scientists, have a really difficult time, right, caring about numerical information. This book called Numbers and Nerves is a great academic book, and one of the central themes that they talk about is that if we see, for example, one person drowning, we are ready to save that person, right? That person is everything to us. If we see even just one more person in the background also drowning, we care a little bit less about saving either one of them. And if that number becomes huge, right, or if it becomes this big, unfathomable problem, we just shut off. We become numb to it, and we shut off, right? So some of these quotes here are great. Like, anything that happens on a large scale seems to require that we use numbers to describe it, and yet numbers are precisely the mode of discourse that leaves audiences numb and messages devoid of meaning. I don't know how many of you have been to a science talk, like a real sort of bona fide science talk, but it's lots of graphs that are almost deliberately illegible so that we look smart and you guys get confused, I guess. But with climate change, we have to solve this problem, right? This is not something that we can just talk about abstractly. Like, we actually have to solve climate change, right? So there is a space in all people, even in scientists, though most won't admit it, right? Whose daily currency, the scientists whose daily currency even is the worldview we call quantification, right? Like, I do quantifiable work. That cries out for words and images and stories for the discourse of emotion. I think part of the reason why I have been invited to give so many talks about this is precisely because my talks, the way I talk about this, is story. It's a story. I'm telling a story. People want to hear a story. A story resonates. Big numbers don't resonate, right? The desensitizing inundation of vaguely worrisome information results in a collective shutting down of compassion that's difficult to overcome. Information is not morally neutral, and we need to find points of emotional connection. So, to sum that all up, how do we transmit quantitative information, right? The magnitude of this problem. How do we get that across without succumbing to what I call numerical numbness? This is a big question that we should be asking ourselves in the science world all of the time. So obviously, I think art will help us, right? And I just want to note that art and science are not these two totally disparate, siloed disciplines. In fact, historically, they've been almost the same thing, right? Here's an image from Georges Cuvier's 1821 book, which I don't speak French and I'm not going to pronounce that word because it'll come out wrong and someone will make fun of me. But this book is essentially Cuvier is credited, because of this book, with sort of uncovering the mysteries of extinction. And the way that he did this is by drawing this image of a skeleton of an American mastodon. They found bones in the Ohio River Valley that they thought belonged to an elephant or a hippopotamus or something. And then Georges Cuvier said, no, this is an animal actually that does not exist anymore. It's extinct. This was a new concept in 1821 Europe. But you can see that it's actually a drawing. The way he uncovered this was through a drawing. This, to me, is art and science. But we just think of this as, I guess, science, right? Or I don't know that artists would consider this art today. But in my opinion, right, there is a very clear overlap between art and art making and science and scientific knowledge making. We all observe, right? Artists observe, scientists observe, we're all creative, and we're all looking for solutions to explain things. So I would be remiss to talk about the role that art can play in the climate crisis without showing some artwork from some of my students. So I teach art students, and many of them are truly brilliant artists. And for their final projects, I asked them to, for example, for my environmental disasters class, they need to sort of research and investigate an environmental disaster, write an essay, and also create an artistic artifact. Here are two examples. On the left, this is by a student of mine, Ken Buckingham. This is actually a glass-blown water bottle that looks like a plastic Nestle water bottle. And the gag is that the plastic bottle that this was modeled after is actually this koozie. It's commentary on plastic, our obsession with plastic, the unsustainability of plastic, et cetera, et cetera. On the right, this is one of my favorite projects that any student has ever done. I'm going to actually show you the whole video. This is a project by my student Ola Wilk-Bernass called Cake for Birds and Mothers. So just some background. On the Chicago shoreline where I live, there is an endangered species of bird called the piping plover. So say that 25 times fast. And the piping plover has had a difficult time nesting because the shoreline is now all concrete. So they've been rewilding it in recent years, right, which is what you see here, these grasses, these native Midwestern grasses. And so my student, and so in 2019, a piping plover nest was seen for the first time in over a decade along the Chicago shoreline. So they're back. And so my student researched what they eat and made them a cake out of nuts and seeds and all these things, put it at the lakefront, and wrote a really beautiful poem, which I'm going to play now. I just love it so much. It like made me cry the first time I saw it. But as you can see how this really, it creates this emotional connection. I am deeply invested in those piping plovers staying alive now, right? So can we do this for all of the sort of environmental problems that we are confronting? I think we can. I also want to talk just a little bit about the role that design can play. I'm at an art and design school, and I am constantly told that art and design are very different things. And I just wanted to describe a little project that I did with a designer to help sort of push my point along, and then I'm going to return back to art at the end. So there is a role for design. I think there's actually a very clear role for design in science. So the human-centered design process, right, which I'll show a slide of in a second, begins with a very intentional step where they aim to understand the people and the problem. The thing that they're designing, they've got to talk to people first, right? This is called contextual inquiry. They study stakeholders in their context of action or in order to build a clear understanding of what they do and what they need. And so with this project at JPL, where I worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab, with the team that I was working on, the satellite team, which is called MISR. NASA loves acronyms. I mean, NASA even is an acronym. And so everything is an acronym, right? So, and it has to sound like, you have to be able to pronounce it, MISR. And so this, with us, entailed multiple interview sessions, discussions, workflow demonstrations, and in particular, sketching. Okay, so sketching is something that designers do. It's a very low-cost way of outlining the problem before they get started on it. And so I'm actually in the process right now of applying to get permission to do a project where I ask scientists, instead of taking notes, written notes for a month, instead they sketch all of their ideas. And I want to see how that process plays out from a scientific perspective. But I think there's actually something deeper here, right? If we compare the design process to what I'm calling the simplified scientific method, for all the scientists in here, I understand that this is a very iterative process and it's not a straight line. But for the purposes of this, it's a straight line with little circles in between all the steps. But the human-centered design process is pretty analogous to the scientific method in that there's ideation and prototyping and refinement and materialization, much like there's hypothesizing, experimentation, analysis, and concluding. However, as I mentioned, the design process begins with this very intentional understanding step where there's empathizing, listening, and learning from stakeholders. And I think that this is formally absent from the scientific method. And I think that by including it in the scientific method or including elements of it or drawing from it, we can actually do better science. We can actually create better scientific knowledge. I'm also not the only person to think about this. I have some colleagues who were working on a similar project around the same time that I was. That paper that they published is called Designing Drought Indicators, where they redesigned drought indicators for California farmers and water managers and that whole thing. So briefly, the project that I worked on, we redesigned a wildfire plume height data delivery system. I said that I worked on wildfires. During my time at NASA, we used our satellite to look at all the wildfires on the globe and how high the smoke from those fires was getting into the atmosphere, and we created this database. The problem is that nobody used the database, even though the data were amazing, in my opinion. So just to give you some background, there are fires that occur on every continent at all times of the year. So this map from a Sally Archibald paper from 2017, every blue dot indicates a fire that was started intentionally by humans. And you can see that they're everywhere. Most fires actually occur in the tropics, in Africa and South America, and Indonesia, but there are fires in the mid-latitudes, in Canada, in Russia. No fires on Antarctica yet. However, a few years ago, there was a fire seen for the first time on Greenland, so I imagine it's just a matter of time before we even see fires on Antarctica. And as I said, we used our satellite, MISR, to compute how high, this is a smoke plume from a fire, how high that was getting into the atmosphere. And we created a database. These are all the plumes that we have in that database. As you can see, it lines up pretty well with that map I just showed. They're on every continent, and they get up into the atmosphere anywhere between 0.5 and 4 kilometers. Pretty high, right? The problem is that to obtain these data, you have to go to this website, which I can say looks like shit. It does. It was designed by a scientist for scientists. And I don't even know how to use it, and I'm a scientist. So we thought, what if we redesigned this, right? What if we worked with the design team, we redesigned this? Would people use these data, right? So we did. We worked with the design team. We hired some designers. We hired a software engineer. And we worked through this process. We began with this understanding, this sketching, this collaborating. We moved to ideation and prototyping, refinement, and materialization. And the result, I think, is going to blow you away, blew us away. It was like Jaws on the floor kind of thing. This was finally published and made available so that actually scientists can use it last year. So we're still doing some follow-up to see like if there's been any difference in usage and that sort of thing. But just to remind you, here's the original website. Bad. Horrible. And here's the new website. So not only does it look beautiful, right, but it's also extremely functional. I can see the data, right? I can physically see the data before I'm even downloading the data. So I don't even have to fuss around with, all of the Python code or whatever to download these data that are in some God knows what format, right? I always say, I went to school to be a climate scientist, not a computer programmer. My computer programming skills are subpar, and yet most scientists these days need to learn pretty advanced computer programming languages to even download data. So we're like, what if we can eliminate that step? What if we can make this all easier to use, right? So you can see very quickly sort of one of the variables of the fire, how high the plumes are, how many plumes there are. It's color-coded. You can filter by biome, by region, by that sort of thing. Sorry. And you get a picture of what the data look like before you even start doing any analysis. So now I can be an actual climate scientist and ask science questions, right, about these data. So this process was really illuminating for me. It actually is what set me on my path to thinking that we need to include art in science. And we actually had the great fortune of publishing this, which was a Herculean task, because getting a journal, a scientific journal, to publish an interdisciplinary art and science project was harder than you think. But we did publish it, so if you want to read all the details, this is the title of the paper. Reimagining Futures, Collaborations Between Artists, Designers, and Scientists as a Roadmap to Help Solve the Climate Crisis. But I said I would return to art, so that's my design stuff. I think it's really cool, but now I'm increasingly invested in art, and specifically abstract art. And this is what has led me to this idea of Solarpunk. So what is Solarpunk, first of all? Some people that I was talking to have actually not heard this word. Have you guys heard the word Solarpunk before? Okay, not too many people. I did not come up with this word, as much as I would love to take credit for it. I did not come up with it. But how many of you have heard of cyberpunk? Yeah, more people, right? So cyberpunk is like the dystopian version of solarpunk. So cyberpunk is like Blade Runner. Have you guys seen Blade Runner? Yeah. Please, everyone go see Blade Runner if you haven't. It's the best science fiction movie in the world. So cyberpunk imagines this sort of like techno dystopian future, right? Solarpunk imagines a future where humans are, you guessed it, part of nature, where we actually harness our own human ingenuity in concert with the beauty and power and care of the natural world to create a future, a better future, right? So fear, okay, fear is an incredibly powerful emotion. But Solarpunk says, let's forget about fear. Let's turn fear actually into hope. Because while fear is this really important motivator, it's an important emotion, okay, it does trigger a response. It can't sustain a durational response to a big problem, okay? Don't confuse fear with anger. Anger is good. Fear is not good, right? If we're going to address this monumental, long time scale problem, like climate change, okay, we have to turn fear into hope. So this is where Solarpunk comes in. Because Solarpunk says, okay, we've had enough warnings. We need solutions. We need to imagine this future. We need to imagine this natural future, right? We have to turn negative emotions into positive ones. No more warnings, we need solutions. And so Solarpunk is seeking to provide the framework for imagining a more hopeful future by incorporating historically excluded voices, ideas, approaches, spaces, knowledge, and science. This is where artists come in, I think. So from the art perspective, I think Solarpunk is still this really new concept, right? It's still in its nascent stages. And I think most people think of Solarpunk art as being this Studio Ghibli film, right? So I don't know how many of you watch the Studio Ghibli sort of anime films. They're all on HBO Max. But Solarpunk artwork, okay, has traditionally been expressed by blending the aesthetics of human technological ingenuity with the lush beauty of the natural world, and has often been compared to the sprawling, luscious landscapes of a Studio Ghibli film, okay? This is what we typically think of as Solarpunk. Think cities, with shining, glimmering, like metal buildings and like trees on top of them, maybe, or trees coming out the windows. Something an issue that I have with this type of artwork is that everything is really like sterile and sanitized looking, but the future and nature is pretty dirty, right? It's pretty messy. There's no dirt. I don't see any dirt. I don't see a lot of that. I see a lot of pristine, sort of natural and human sort of made, beautiful, shiny technological objects. So at the end of last semester, a student of mine approached me after our abrupt climate change class and said, Mika, I want to work on this. I have like so much anxiety about climate change, and I want to do something, and I'm thinking I want it to be like Solarpunk. And I was like, okay, I'm into it, because I'm also into Solarpunk. So we started working together, but we wanted to throw out all these preconceived ideas of what Solarpunk is. The artist that I work with, Javi, is an abstract painter, right? So very sort of, colors and shapes that are recognizable but not actually things that exist in real life. And so we were like, how can we design a project that investigates Solarpunk, right? Thinks about Solarpunk, but also along the lines of climate change and how we solve this crisis. Before I get to that, there's a few projects that I did before I met Javi that I would consider Solarpunk. So I worked with a student, Eli, who is a brilliant electronic music producer. As you could tell from my introduction, I am really into queer electronic music. I think that electronic dance spaces have the power to be really transformative politically. They always have been. And so I think that there's definitely a space to harness that energy for climate change, for solving the climate crisis. I actually have a grant right now that I'm hoping gets funded for us to throw an eco-rave. So cross your fingers, which I think would be so freaking cool. But this project by Eli was a 3-year project, multimedia project. There's a zine, there's an electronic music album, and then they also made a few music videos for YouTube. And the project is called Plastic City. So Eli imagines this future where we've collected all the plastic from the ocean and we've turned it into a city where we can now live, right? So this, to me, feels very Solarpunk, okay? And I wanted to just show you a clip. So this is the beginning of the music video that sort of explains the project. So in a distant future, a plastic city powered by music floats the seas of Earth, recycling plastic from the water for its self-contained systems, right? So this is this going to happen? Like, I don't know, probably not, maybe. But this is this radical imagining, right, that we need to do if we're going to solve climate change, okay? We're tapping into this optimism and hope and aesthetic beauty to think about addressing these problems. So this is one project. I also worked with a student, Kelvin, on a similar project. Kelvin took Jimi Hendrix live rendition of the Star Spangled Banner that was performed at Woodstock in 1969, and modified the sound with a sinusoidal graph that follows the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So it gets increasingly faster as you move through the song. I'm not going to play it because it's honestly, it's jarring for 9:30 in the morning. Because by the end it becomes incredibly dysphonic and almost like difficult to listen to, and that's the point, right? So a lot of this type of work has already been done. I think a lot of people do sonify climate data. I thought it was really cool that Kelvin sonified the Star-Spangled Banner for obvious reasons. First of all, when he made this project, it was exactly 50 years from 1969 to 2019. Also, you know, Jimi Hendrix was playing at Woodstock, which is this sort of like liberatory event, right? We're trying to break free from society, which has sort of created all of these problems. And then, of course, the Star-Spangled Banner. I mean, the United States is like one of the largest emitters of fossil fuels, one of the biggest culprits of climate change. So it's definitely a very pointed critique on our role in furthering the climate crisis. So these are just screenshots from his Instagram. You can also listen to it on my website if you're brave. But what if we thought about the synthesis of art and science in a totally different way? And this will be my sort of how I can conclude this work. So what if instead of a didactic approach, right, this really explanatory approach, per the previous slides that I've shown, right, the cake for mothers and the plastic city and the Star-Spangled Banner, additive synthesis of a climate crisis, what if instead we considered a more emotional and metaphorical approach, right? So I think I've already convinced you that art is so important and powerful for communicating emotion, for reaching us in places where data and numbers and science, traditional science, capital S science is what I call it, science can't reach us, right? What if instead we consider this more metaphorical approach? And so this is where Javi comes in the work that I'm doing now. So Javi is a 23-year-old abstract artist who spent much of his life worrying about what his future in a climate change world will look like. As a queer Filipino member of Gen Z, Javi is often overcome with what we describe as climate anxiety, right? This crippling distress related to worries about the effect of climate change. So for the past 9 months, Javi and I have been working together thinking about ways that abstract painting can be used to catalyze imaginative thinking about not only how to solve climate change, but also how to accept that the solution might not be a utopia and that that's okay. Often we're told if we don't get a utopia, we're going to get a dystopia. We're probably going to get something in between. And it's our job to make sure that whatever that in between is good as it can be. That we solve climate change and we ensure that our future is as good as it can be. Right? A lot of times people say, oh, well, if we don't do something in the next 8 years, there's going to be too much warming and it's going to be considered catastrophic climate change, and that's that, I guess. But I always say 2.1 degrees of warming, even though it's above 2 degrees of warming, right, which is kind of the cutoff for catastrophic climate change, 2.1 degrees of warming is better than 2.2 degrees of warming, is better than 3 degrees of warming. It's always going to be better, right, than if we didn't do anything, than if we let it get even worse. So I think a lot of times, you read the New York Times, it's apocalypse, apocalypse, apocalypse. We're in the apocalypse, right? This is the apocalypse. That forecloses the potential for solutions, right? If we think, oh, well, if we don't do anything in the next 6 years, then I guess we're fucked, sorry, right? That's really bad thinking, I think. It forecloses on the potential for solutions, and it makes us sad and depressed and despairing. So I'm like this cloyingly annoying optimist where I'm like, no, stop that, right? Whatever we do, it can be good, and we can do this, and it will be better than if we don't do anything. So that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to imagine, open our minds to all the potential solutions. And so the way we began this process was completely open-ended, and I said, Javi, make a painting, just make any painting about climate change and what it means to you right now, right? And he called this painting Beginning, because it really was the beginning of this process. And it's a metaphor for how we need to start thinking about all of the solutions to climate change. Because right now, I think you look at these bills, you read the newspaper, whatever, the solutions are always like engineering, right, solutions, or it's a really narrow solution set. And when the solution set starts narrow, it gets narrower and narrower as you consider those solutions. And you end up with only a handful of mostly bad solutions. So what we have to do is back up and open up to the whole universe of potential solutions. So I say the word universe because to me, I think the painting that Javi painted looks like the universe, right? Javi gets mad at me when I say that because it's not the universe. So Javi would describe this painting as capturing the beauty of the natural world, the chaos of climate change, and the potential of human ingenuity. And it's hanging in my house right now, which is very lucky of me. But this was just the beginning. So then I said to Javi, okay, keep going. We started. We have a starting point. Let's see if we can use this painting process to serve as a metaphor for how we're going to solve climate change. And so beginning was just that, a beginning. And so just as we must consider all the potential solutions to climate change before we commit to ones that will work, Javi wanted to start with a totally formless abstract painting and work towards a more explanatory painting with more form and more clear meaning, right? And so these are the next 4 paintings in that process. The first one on the left, Strawberry Fields Forever. For some reason, Javi is obsessed with strawberries. This one is called Margins, and it's referencing sort of Art Deco, natural illustration aesthetics. And then we have Altoid here, which you can see there's increasing form. Javi loves these circles, these orbs. And then finally, E-stress on the far right, where you see things starting to take shape. We don't know what it is, but it's something, right? Just like we don't know what the solution to climate change is going to be, it's going to be something. And so this continues, right? Here's his most recent work, which has a lot of form to it. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's seed pods. Maybe it's, something else. There's depth. There's layers, right? So Javi continues to work along this trajectory from a formless abstract painting to a more formed abstract painting, with this painting serving as both meaning-making artifacts that reference the natural world. I mean, they look really pretty, in my opinion, right? They're beautiful, natural, abstract art, but also as a metaphor for the imagining process that we are and will internalize when we solve climate change. And I'll note that exposure to art that's inspired by the natural environment increases, there's a lot of research that shows this, that it increases our salience of our personal biospheric values. And biospheric values are these values that advocate a concern with the quality of nature and the environment for its own sake, right? Not involving us, but just the environment for its own sake. And so I'm constantly inspired by this quote from Octavia Butler, because I think it really sums up all of this work. As bad as everything is, right? As horrible as the projections are, as stuck as we may seem, as apocalyptic as the New York Times makes the climate crisis sound every day. And let's not mince words. It's bad. Okay, no one is saying it's good. It is bad. We get it. It's bad. But I'll also remind you that when we use the word apocalypse, right, there have been many apocalypses throughout human history. The indigenous people on this continent experienced an apocalypse 400 years ago. You could argue, right? So I want us to get away from that apocalypse narrative, to get away from that fear and that despair, and start thinking, as Octavia Butler says, about that beautiful glint of water through the trees, right? So the world is full of painful stories. Sometimes it seems as though there aren't any other kind, and yet I found myself thinking how beautiful that glint of water was through the trees. So I'll just end by saying that this isn't the end of the world, but I really hope it's the end of this world. Because we now have this radical and revolutionary opportunity to make the next world better, brighter, more equitable, right? But if we don't first imagine the future that we want, if we don't consider all the possible futures, right, all the possible solutions, then we'll definitely never have the future we deserve. And we must incorporate diverse voices, which includes artists, if we're going to get to the next world. So I will take questions. Thank you. No questions? I was that good, huh? That's right. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, the media, the way media plays into this. I mean, Pixar has created worlds that are definitely invoking this idea of solarpunk or the aesthetics of it in any way. And I think that using different forms of media, animation. I work with animators. We have a lot of animators at the school. Animation, painting, performance, everything, all hands on deck, I think, absolutely. No, there's a board game called Solar. God damn it, now I have to change my title. Well, I've never heard of that, so, okay.
To like a solarpunk future, I guess. It's really good.
Is the Solarpunk future good in the game?
Well, like you have to invent it.
Oh, you have to invent
yeah,
it?
Yeah.
Oh my god, so it's literally this?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, I should totally, is it, let me see. Yeah, send it to me. Wow, does that mean I have to retitle my talk? And my whole paper? Anyway, thank you, that's great. I will definitely look into that. That's amazing, thank you. It's like a perfect example of this, yeah. I promise I did not steal the title from this board game.
So like one of the most important features of art is getting them to the public and having the most viewers of your art, so you have somebody that can really connect and make change. What are some good ways that this solarpunk art has been able to reach the public and really make big, sweeping emotional changes?
Wow, that's a really loaded question. Well, it's definitely still at the beginning stages of this project. I will say in the fall, in this past fall, December, we had our big American Geophysical Union meeting, which is the largest gathering of climate scientists in the world. AGU is the acronym. We love acronyms. And we had, for the first time, a fine art show. I'm not going to call it a show because that does a disservice to the show that we had last night, which is an actual art show. This was a curation of a couple pieces of art. We had it at the American Geophysical Union. I also gave a similar talk in front of an audience of about maybe 1,000 scientists, and I continue to get feedback from that meeting alone about how sort of moving it was. And I was talking last night with my fellow speakers, and I was saying my talks are often geared towards, I'm gearing this towards scientists, because I think scientists are the ones that are, we're kind of restricting ourselves. We're like, no. To do science, it has to be unbiased. You probably hear that word a lot. It has to be unbiased in this silo, and we publish in these journals, and like 200 people read the paper, and that's real science. Like, I'm a real scientist. But when I talk about this stuff, a lot of scientists, it's like the light bulb goes off. They're like, oh my God, yeah, we do need to do something, right? So even if I'm just moving scientists, that alone feels like a huge accomplishment to me. But in terms of other stuff, right, there's, in Chicago, there's a ton of public art. We do a lot of public art. There's a lot of stuff going on all the time. So we're trying to do more of that, working with folks at UChicago and Northwestern and UIC. Also at the school that I'm at, a colleague and I have curated a collection or curriculum of classes called Art in the Environment, where we're aiming to allow students to the ability to sign up for this curriculum where they can then take sort of a prescribed set of classes. We don't have majors. You can't get like a BFA in sculpture. You just get a BFA. But this will give them this orientation. If they want to do environmental art or work that deals with the environmental crisis, they can take these classes that are along this curriculum and have a more tailored, school learning experience, and then hopefully go out into the world as my little climate change art activists. And we're in the process, we're hoping to turn that curriculum into a center for art in the environment. We just need a rich benefactor, so if anybody in here, no, I'm just kidding. If anybody has connections to Chicago and a lot of money, because I think that that's really the platform that we can use to then go out into the world. Like, my role is to create these artists and these scientists who are committed to this work, and then I hope that they'll take their work everywhere, wherever they go. Javi, applied for a few study abroad programs, is going to be going abroad in the fall, and is continuing to work on building out a Solarpunk archive, not archive, portfolio, and really like has committed to making this his like artistic life's mission, that sort of thing. So we're definitely still in the earlier stages of this, but I am open to all all potential opportunities for disseminating this to the public. I think that's the whole point.
So funny enough, I'm actually friends with Javi.
No shit. He is from
yeah.
Austin. He is from Austin.
Yeah, no, seeing his work was, I don't know, I've seen him kind of grow as an artist, so it was really interesting to see his abstract work. But besides that, as an artist myself and someone who's an environmental studies minor, I think it's really hard for us to find a way to like positively show environmental change, because oftentimes like you see it in such a negative light. So as an artist, like how would you maybe suggest looking at the more positive light, and like what outlets would you consider looking at?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think Javi and I have like this conversation like once a week. I have to talk him off the ledge. You know, he's like, "Oh my God, Mika, everything's so bad. Like I don't know what to do." But I do think a lot of times what has helped in this particular project with Javi is how do I say this without sounding like an asshole? Like my own mentorship, because I'm basically like this cloyingly optimistic person, you know, and I'm just like, Javi, you know, we can create a good future. We don't have to show all the bad stuff. We can think and imagine what's going to come in the future. So do I have, you know, books to read to suggest? Absolutely. I can like dig those up. I think that I don't know. I don't exactly know how to answer this question, because you're right. It is really hard. Trying to center joy and optimism, it's really hard work, but it's important work, I think. I think having community and care, you know, as a queer person, and Javi's a queer person, we talk a lot about how queer people build our own worlds. We build our own worlds for ourselves, and we don't want straight people. No, I'm just kidding. I'm happy to have straight people come into my queer world. But, you know, we do build these like queer worlds for ourselves, and in much of the same way that we need to build this better world, I reference how we build these queer worlds, and I think about what we do, and we center joy, and we center care, and we center all of those things. I mean, talking with, there's a faculty at SAIC who has been a great influence for me, and also for Anthony, not to call you out, but is Mark Jeffrey, and he's one of the people who told me, like, this is what we do. We build queer worlds from a place of joy, rather than a place of despair. So I would encourage you to try to internalize joy and think about ways that we can, you know, be joyous in the way we think about the future, rather than despairing. That's why my whole thing is like fear, despair, whatever. It's joy. Joy is what we're really after here. So trying to center that, and I can find you after and give you some like book recommendations, yeah. I think.
Thank you so much. So I guess like one of like my main concerns in like I guess sustainability right now is like fast fashion and whatnot, specifically with like Shein and whatnot, and how people seem to, I guess, have a desire to just accumulate it because it speaks to them for some reason. I think along those same lines, I think fashion, especially through cool art and whatnot, people can relate to and see and want to be a part of. And so I guess I was just asking for your ideas on it. How do you think that partaking or putting science more into fashion and through whatever it be and making it more accessible and more appealing to people, is that along the same lines as what this potential goal is for your project? Absolutely.
I am in constant war with the fashion department at SAIC because of their unsustainability. Honestly, I think that, I might get in trouble for saying this, but anyway, we'll do it anyway. So a couple years ago, Swarovski wanted to sponsor me as like the Swarovski chair of climate change at SAIC, and I said no, because I'm not going to do that. I'm better than that, and I don't need that. I don't need to be associated with this idea of like consumption to make the world better, right? Like, I think fundamentally what you're getting at here is that we're told by companies that to be sustainable, we have to buy a thing, right? Like, if you want to be sustainable and go to Starbucks, you have to buy the Starbucks reusable cup. And I just don't think that's a really good approach to sustainability at all. In terms of fashion, fast fashion is like a scourge on the planet for sure. I mean, Shein, even H&M, and like Zara, like all these places, right? They pump out these cheap clothes, and then you've got leftists on Twitter who are arguing that this is accessibility because like not everyone can afford expensive clothes. And I just think that that argument is like so warped and messed up. So I do have some fashion students who I've worked with before, not super closely, but I've had some fashion students in my class. We're trying to focus on reusing clothes, right? Material exists. There's a lot of fabric out there that exists everywhere. And repurposing that, right? Creating pieces that mean something to you that you're gonna wanna wear, super important. And I've had some students do some really fun projects where they kind of imagined what the fashion might look like if sea level rises and they made like, you know, heels that can also like flow on water. I mean, some of it is not real, but again, that's part of the imagining process, right? Is like, how can we transform all of these basic things in our lives? So yeah, absolutely, I think fashion is art. I mean, we have a fashion department at the art school, so that to me means it's art because I'm a scientist, and whatever they tell me is art at SAIC is art. So I think fashion absolutely needs to play a role and needs to honestly get its act together a little bit and be more sustainable, but in the right way. I think slapping sustainability on top of it because you used 50% recycled materials, that's not the answer. Yeah. Thanks.
You mentioned briefly kind of this idea of dance and dance spaces as activators of social change. Could you just talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to sustainability? Sorry, allergies.
I would love to. Thank you for asking me that question. I live in Chicago, and Chicago is the birthplace of house music, Chicago house music. And Chicago house music was born out of black, queer folks, especially folks on the south side of Chicago, in protest of partly the history goes in protest of all the burning of the disco tracks that they did at Comiskey Park. And so it's always been this like site of political activation, right? Techno is born from black, cis and queer, musicians in Detroit for the same reason, as a form of resistance, as a space where it's not just people going to have fun, but it's also people resisting whatever it might be, right? The external factors. Also, joy is resistance. In many ways in our world, being happy is in my opinion, a form of resistance, right? Like experiencing joy, experiencing community, being in community with people. So Kim mentioned at the beginning of my introduction that last summer I gave a similar talk to this at a rave in the woods of Pennsylvania. And it was packed. Like there was actually more people than in this room at this talk at a rave. So that to me shows that people are really invested in this. They really want to be part of this, right? They really want to be part of this movement and this way of imagining. And I think that for too long we've just written off large segments of ways that people can engage. And we're like, no, the only way you can talk about climate change is by showing these graphs and these numbers and writing articles that say how bad it is, when it's like, or what if we went into these like dance spaces and we like dance, and we also talked about how queer world building can help us build worlds post-climate change, right? That kind of stuff. Getting people excited, getting people to feel joy in these spaces, I think is so important. So this is what I'm mostly working with Mark Jeffrey on, is dance spaces, queer dance spaces, because he's a queer performance professor at SAIC, and we've talked a lot about how queer dance is a form of sort of resistance. And yeah, thank you.
We're gonna take a very quick 15-minute break. I think there's coffee back there, and then have a panel. If you have more questions for Mika, she will be part of a panel along with Kelly Johnson, the curator of our show, and Anthony Romero, who gave a talk yesterday. So 15 minutes, and then we'll see you back up here.